The year was 1944, and the world was engulfed in the chaos of war. The temperature on this particular day, June 6th, was a chilly 55 degrees Fahrenheit, with a gentle mist rolling in off the English Channel. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the sweet scent of wet earth and the distant smell of salt water. The sky above was a deep shade of gray, with clouds that seemed to stretch on forever, like an endless canvas of cotton and smoke. In the early hours of the morning, the sound of engines roaring to life echoed across the countryside, as the Allied forces prepared to launch the largest amphibious assault in history. The beaches of Normandy, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were the targets of this massive operation, with thousands of soldiers, tanks, and landing craft waiting to pour onto the shores of Nazi-occupied France. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the horizon, the Allied armada came into view. The ships, a seemingly endless flotilla of destroyers, cruisers, and troop carriers, stretched across the horizon, their wakes churning the water into a frothy white foam. The sound of anchors dropping, chains rattling, and engines throbbing filled the air as the invasion force began to take shape. On the beaches, the German fortifications stood like sentinels, their concrete bunkers and pillboxes bristling with machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The infamous MG-42 machine guns, with their distinctive ripping cloth sound, were mounted on tripods, waiting to unleash their deadly hail of 7.92 mm bullets upon the approaching Allied troops. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the German trenches, mingling with the smell of diesel fuel and the acrid tang of gunpowder. As the Allied forces began to disembark from their landing craft, the sound of ramp gates dropping and the rattle of equipment being unloaded filled the air. The soldiers, clad in their worn and faded uniforms, moved with a sense of purpose, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their hearts racing with anticipation. The M1 Garand rifles, with their distinctive en bloc clips, were at the ready, as the infantrymen prepared to face the withering fire that awaited them on the beaches. The landing craft, specifically the LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel Hull No. 361, with its ruggedized steel hull and wooden ramp, was the primary means of transporting the troops to the shore. The craft's diesel engine, a robust and reliable GM 6-71, churned out a steady 225 horsepower as it plowed through the choppy waters of the Channel. The LCVP's crew, consisting of a coxswain, a bowman, and 2 machine gunners, worked in tandem to navigate the craft through the treacherous waves, their faces set with determination. As the first wave of troops approached the shore, the sound of artillery fire echoed across the water as the Allied warships, including the USS Texas with its 14-inch guns and the HMS Warspite with its 15-inch guns, began to pound the German fortifications. The shells, ranging in size from 5-inch to 16-inch, screamed through the air, leaving behind trails of smoke and flame as they exploded on impact, sending shrapnel flying in all directions. The Allied troops, as they leapt from the landing craft and into the icy waters of the Channel, were met with a maelstrom of bullets, shells, and shrapnel. The sound of machine guns, artillery, and explosions filled the air as the Germans unleashed their full fury upon the invaders. The soldiers, weighed down by their equipment, struggled to wade through the waist-deep water, their movements slow and labored, as they desperately sought to reach the relative safety of the shore. The air was filled with the acrid smell of smoke, the sweet scent of cordite, and the sickly aroma of blood, as the battle raged on. The cries of the wounded, the shouts of the officers, and the staccato bursts of machine gun fire created a cacophony of sound that was both deafening and terrifying. The beach, once a tranquil and serene landscape, was now a scene of utter chaos, as the fate of the world hung in the balance. As the first wave of troops struggled to establish a foothold on the beach, the second wave, consisting of tanks, artillery, and support troops, began to disembark from their landing craft. The M4 Sherman tanks, with their 75mm guns, and the M3 half-tracks, with their .50 cal machine guns, were the first to hit the shore, their tracks churning the S. And, as they made their way towards the German lines, the sound of their engines, a low rumble, like thunder in the distance, grew louder as they approached the fray, ready to unleash their fury upon the enemy. The German defenders, stationed in their fortified bunkers and trenches, watched in awe as the Allied army poured onto the shore, their faces set with determination, their eyes fixed on the horizon. The MG-42 machine guns, the 88mm flak guns, and the 105mm howitzers were trained on the beach, waiting to unleash their deadly fire as the battle for Normandy reached its crescendo. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the fate of the world hung in the balance, as the greatest battle of the 20th century began to unfold. As the battle commenced, the Allied forces, comprised of units from the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, implemented a multifaceted tactical approach to outmaneuver the enemy. The initial phase of the battle involved a series of coordinated maneuvers, with each flank playing a crucial role in the overall strategy. On the northern flank, the American Infantry Regiment, supported by a battalion of Sherman tanks, advanced in a staggered formation, with the lead company moving in a dispersed pattern to minimize exposure to enemy fire. The troops moved in short, rapid bursts, utilizing the available cover provided by the terrain to reduce their vulnerability to the withering artillery and small arms fire emanating from the mainly's fortified positions. Meanwhile, on the southern flank, the British Armoured Division, consisting of Churchill tanks and infantry carriers, executed a wide, sweeping maneuver, aiming to outflank the enemy's right wing and catch them off guard. The British tanks moved in a column formation, with the lead tank providing covering fire, as the subsequent tanks in the column advanced in a leapfrog fashion, ensuring that the enemy was constantly engaged and unable to regroup. As the British tanks approached the enemy's flank, they began to fan out, forming a broad, armored front that threatened to encircle the enemy's position. The French infantry, positioned in the center, launched a series of probing attacks, aimed at identifying the enemy's weak points and creating openings for the Allied armor to exploit. The French troops moved in tight, cohesive units, with each squad providing mutual support and cover as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The French commander, cognizant of the enemy's propensity for counterattacks, had positioned a reserve force, comprised of freshly mobilized troops, to provide a swift and decisive response to any enemy counterthrust. As the Allied forces continued to press their attack, the enemy's defenses began to show signs of strain. The relentless artillery bombardment, coupled with the incessant pressure exerted by the Allied infantry and armor, had weakened the enemy's resolve and created pockets of vulnerability in their lines. The Allied commander, sensing the shift in momentum, ordered the reserve forces to be committed to the battle, with the aim of delivering a decisive blow that would shatter the enemy's defenses and precipitate a rout. The introduction of the reserve forces, consisting of a fresher, more rested contingent of troops, imbued the Allied attack with renewed vigor and impetus. The reserve units, comprising a mix of infantry, armor, and artillery, were tasked with exploiting the weaknesses in the enemy's lines, created by the earlier Allied attacks. The reserve infantry moved in a series of bounded assaults, with each successive wave of troops leapfrogging the preceding one, to maintain the momentum of the attack and prevent the enemy from regrouping. The Armored Reserve, consisting of a battalion of M4 Sherman tanks, supported by a company of M3 Stuart light tanks, was committed to the battle, with the objective of breaking through the enemy's lines and creating a breach that the infantry could exploit. The tanks moved in a wedge formation, with the M4 Shermans providing the backbone of the attack, while the M3 Stuarts scouted ahead, identifying and neutralizing any enemy anti-tank assets that might threaten the Allied armor. As the reserve forces clashed with the enemy, the battle reached its crescendo, with the outcome hanging precariously in the balance. The enemy, realizing that their defenses were on the brink of collapse, launched a desperate counterattack, aimed at stemming the Allied tide and restoring their weakened lines. The counterattack, spearheaded by a battalion of enemy infantry, supported by a company of enemy tanks, threatened to engulf the Allied reserve forces and jeopardize the entire operation. However, the Allied commander, anticipating the enemy's counterthrust, had positioned a contingent of anti-tank guns and artillery, specifically tasked with neutralizing the enemy's armor and blunting their counterattack. The anti-tank guns, comprising a mix of 57mm and 75mm anti-tank cannons, were sited in a series of carefully prepared ambush positions, from which they could deliver enfilading fire against the enemy's tanks and infantry. The artillery, consisting of a battalion of 105mm howitzers, was positioned to provide indirect fire support, raining down a deluge of high-explosive shells upon the enemy's counter-attacking forces. The combination of anti-tank guns and artillery proved decisive, as the enemy's counterattack was met with a withering wall of fire that decimated their infantry and armor. The enemy's tanks, attempting to maneuver through the treacherous terrain, were particularly vulnerable to the Allied anti-tank guns, which picked off the enemy's armor with relative ease. As the enemy's counterattack faltered and lost momentum, the Allied forces sensed victory within their grasp and pressed their advantage, pouring more troops and armor into the breach created by the earlier attacks. The culmination of the battle witnessed the Allied forces, now bolstered by the introduction of fresh reserves, surging forward in a frenzied, unstoppable assault that shattered the enemy's defenses and sent their troops reeling in disarray. The enemy's lines, once considered impregnable, now lay in tatters, as the Allied forces, driven by a fierce determination and an unyielding commitment to their mission, stormed forward, exploiting the breach and pouring into the enemy's rear areas. As the battle drew to a close, the Allied commander, surveying the aftermath of the carnage, realized that the enemy's defeat was tantamount to a rout, with their forces either killed, captured, or fled in panic. The Allied victory, though purchased at a steep price in blood and treasure, marked a significant turning point in the campaign, as it paved the way for the eventual liberation of the occupied territories and the ultimate defeat of the enemy. The tactics employed by the Allied forces, a masterful blend of armor, infantry, and artillery, had proven decisive, as they had successfully adapted to the enemy's defenses and exploited their weaknesses, ultimately emerging victorious in the face of overwhelming odds. As the dawn broke over the horizon, the sounds of war intensified, with the cacophony of artillery fire, the staccato bursts of machine gun fire, and the screams of the wounded filling the air. The battlefield was a maze of chaos, with soldiers from both sides scrambling to gain the upper hand. The enemy's defensive lines were heavily fortified, with rows of trenches and bunkers that seemed to stretch on forever. The Allied forces, however, were determined to break through, and they launched a fierce assault on the enemy's positions. The Allies' arsenal included the M4 Sherman tank, a behemoth of a machine that was capable of delivering a devastating blow to the enemy's defenses. The M4 Sherman was equipped with a 75mm M3 gun, which had a muzzle velocity of 2,030 feet per second, and could penetrate up to 89mm of armor at a range of 1,000 yards. The tank's armor was also impressive, with a thickness of up to 120mm on the front glacis plate. However, the M4 Sherman's vulnerabilities, such as its high profile and relatively thin side armor, made it susceptible to flanking maneuvers and anti-tank fire. As the M4 Shermans rolled onto the battlefield, they were met with a hail of gunfire from the enemy's anti-tank positions. The enemy's Panzerfausts, which were equipped with a 150mm warhead, were capable of penetrating up to 200mm of armor, making them a formidable threat to the Allied tanks. The Panzerfaust's range was limited to around 30 to 40 yards, but its lethality was unmatched, and the Allies knew that they had to be careful to avoid getting too close to the enemy's positions. The Allies' infantry, meanwhile, was equipped with the M1 Garand rifle, a semi-automatic rifle that was capable of delivering a high volume of fire. The M1 Garand had a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second and was effective at ranges of up to 500 yards. However, its 8-round en-bloc clip made it prone to jamming, and the soldiers had to be careful to keep their rifles clean and well maintained in order to avoid malfunctions. As the battle raged on, the Allies' logistical chain began to feel the strain. The supply lines were stretched thin, and the delivery of critical equipment, such as ammunition and medical supplies, was becoming increasingly difficult. The Allies' quartermasters were working around the clock to ensure that the front lines were stocked with the necessary gear, but it was a daunting task, and the shortage of critical supplies was beginning to take its toll on the troops. The battlefield was a sea of mud and blood, with the bodies of the fallen soldiers littering the ground. The stench of death and decay hung in the air, and the sounds of the wounded filled the ears of the soldiers. The medical corpsmen were doing their best to tend to the wounded, but it was a losing battle, and the number of casualties was mounting by the minute. Despite the chaos and the carnage, the Allies were making slow but steady progress, pushing the enemy back inch by inch. The enemy's lines were beginning to waver, and the Allies could sense victory within their grasp. However, the enemy was far from defeated, and they were determined to exact a heavy toll on the Allied forces. As the day wore on, the fighting only intensified, with both sides trading blows and neither gaining the upper hand. The Allies' air support was providing critical cover, with P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs providing close air support and strafing the enemy's positions. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its 8.50 caliber machine guns and 4 5-inch rockets, was a formidable ground attack aircraft, capable of delivering a devastating blow to the enemy's defenses. However, the enemy's anti-aircraft fire was taking its toll on the Allied air support, and the number of aircraft losses was mounting. The Allies' pilots were flying sorties around the clock, but the enemy's defenses were too strong, and the Allies were beginning to feel the strain. As the sun began to set on the battlefield, the Allies were exhausted, but they knew that they couldn't afford to let up. The enemy was still strong, and the Allies had to keep pushing forward if they were going to achieve their objectives. The night ahead would be long and brutal, with both sides launching patrols and raids in an effort to gain the upper hand. The Allies' commanders were huddled together, poring over maps and discussing strategy. They knew that the next 24 hours would be critical, and they had to make the right decisions if they were going to emerge victorious. The enemy was still strong, but the Allies had the momentum, and they were determined to keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. As the night wore on, the sounds of the battlefield began to take on a different tone. The artillery fire had died down, and the machine gunfire had become more sporadic. The sounds of the wounded still filled the air, but they were no longer the dominant sound. Instead, the sounds of the soldiers, talking and laughing, had begun to emerge. The soldiers were trying to find some semblance of normalcy in the midst of chaos, and they were clinging to each other for support. The night was dark and foreboding, but the Allies were undaunted. They knew that the dawn would bring another day of fighting, and they were ready. They were exhausted, but they were resolute, and they were determined to see the battle through to its conclusion. The enemy was still out there, waiting to strike, but the Allies were ready. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the Allies steeled themselves for another day of battle. They knew that it would be brutal and intense, but they were ready. They had the training, the equipment, and the determination to see the battle through to its conclusion. The enemy was strong, but the Allies were stronger, and they were determined to emerge victorious. The battle was far from over, but the Allies were confident that they would ultimately prevail. As the crescendo of chaos reached its zenith, the once coherent battlefield descended into an abyss of unmitigated bedlam. The shriek of artillery fire reverberated through the air, a deafening cacophony that threatened to shatter the very fabric of reality. The ground trembled beneath the feet of the combatants, as if the earth itself was being torn asunder by the unrelenting fury of the clash. To the north, the 12th Infantry Division, their bayonets glinting like a sea of razor-sharp teeth, charged headlong into the maelstrom with a ferocity that bordered on the suicidal. Their rifles, now mere clubs in the face of the enemy's withering fire, were brandished with a desperation that only served to underscore the desperate plight of the attackers. The enemy lines, a seemingly impenetrable fortress of steel and flame, blazed with a fury that appeared almost otherworldly, as if the very gates of hell had been flung open to unleash a torrent of devastation upon the beleaguered troops. Meanwhile, to the south, the armored column, its tanks a juggernaut of unyielding steel, ground inexorably forward, leaving in its wake a trail of smoldering ruin and death. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of burning oil and scorched metal, as if the very earth itself was being seared by the relentless onslaught. The enemy, their positions pounded into rubble by the unrelenting barrage, stumbled backward in disarray, their cries of terror and despair mingling with the thunder of the guns in a ghastly symphony of destruction. As the battle raged on, the lines between reality and madness began to blur, and the combatants, their senses numbed by the constant barrage, stumbled forward with a zombie-like fervor, driven solely by the primal urge to survive. The sky above, a deep, foreboding crimson, seemed to darken with each passing moment, as if the very heavens themselves were being consumed by the all-encompassing fury of the conflict. In the midst of this unmitigated chaos, a lone figure emerged, a giant of a man with a face chiseled from granite and eyes that burned with an inner fire. His rifle, a trusty companion in the face of unrelenting horror, was grasped with a fierce determination, as if the very fate of the world hung in the balance. With a cry that was both a battle yell and a prayer, he launched himself forward, a one-man army against the tidal wave of enemy steel, his footsteps echoing through the din like the beat of a death knell. The earth shuddered beneath his feet as he charged, the ground splitting asunder to reveal a chasm of smoldering hellfire, a yawning abyss of ruin and destruction that seemed to stretch on forever. The enemy lines, a blur of steel and flame, wavered and stumbled, their cries of terror and despair echoing through the void like the whispers of the damned. And yet, undaunted by the unrelenting fury of the enemy, the lone warrior pressed on, his rifle blazing with a fierce and unyielding determination, his footsteps echoing through the battle-scarred landscape like the drumbeat of destiny. The enemy, their positions crumbling beneath the onslaught, stumbled backward in disarray, their cries of terror and despair mingling with the thunder of the guns in a ghastly symphony of destruction. The air was heavy with the stench of death and smoke, the sky above a deep, foreboding crimson that seemed to darken with each passing moment. And yet, even as the battle raged on, there existed a sense of eerie calm, a feeling that the very fate of the world hung in the balance, poised precariously on the edge of a precipice from which there was no return. In this maelstrom of chaos, where the rules of reality no longer applied, the lone warrior stood as a colossus, a titan of unyielding fury who defied the very odds of survival. His rifle, now a mere extension of his being, blazed with a fierce and unrelenting intensity, cutting a swath of destruction through the enemy lines like a scythe through wheat. The earth shuddered beneath his feet, the ground splitting asunder to reveal a chasm of smoldering hellfire, a yawning abyss of ruin and destruction that seemed to stretch on forever. And yet, even as the battle raged on, there existed a sense of inevitability, a feeling that the outcome was already predetermined, that the course of history was being irreparably altered by the unrelenting fury of the clash. The enemy lines, once a seemingly impenetrable fortress of steel and flame, now wavered and stumbled, their cries of terror and despair echoing through the void like the whispers of the damned. The air was heavy with the stench of death and smoke, the sky above a deep, foreboding crimson that seemed to darken with each passing moment. In this vortex of chaos, where the very fabric of reality seemed to be torn asunder, the lone warrior stood as a beacon of hope, a shining exemplar of unyielding determination in the face of unrelenting horror. His rifle, now a mere extension of his being, blazed with a fierce and unrelenting intensity, cutting a swath of destruction through the enemy lines like a scythe through wheat. The earth shuddered beneath his feet, the ground splitting asunder to reveal a chasm of smoldering hellfire, a yawning abyss of ruin and destruction that seemed to stretch on forever. As the battle raged on, the outcome hanging precariously in the balance, the lone warrior pressed forward, driven by a fierce and unyielding determination to survive, to overcome, and to emerge victorious from the abyss of chaos that had engulfed the world. The enemy lines, once a seemingly impenetrable fortress of steel and flame, now wavered and stumbled, their cries of terror and despair echoing through the void like the whispers of the damned. The air was heavy with the stench of death and smoke, the sky above a deep, foreboding crimson that seemed to darken with each passing moment. And yet, even in the midst of this unmitigated chaos, there existed a sense of eerie calm, a feeling that the very fate of the world hung in the balance, poised precariously on the edge of a precipice from which there was no return. The lone warrior, his rifle blazing with a fierce and unrelenting intensity, stood as a colossus, a titan of unyielding fury, who defied the very odds of survival. The earth shuddered beneath his feet, the ground splitting asunder to reveal a chasm of smoldering hellfire, a yawning abyss of ruin and destruction that seemed to stretch on forever. In this maelstrom of chaos, where the rules of reality no longer applied, the lone warrior stood as a beacon of hope, a shining exemplar of unyielding determination in the face of unrelenting horror. His rifle, now a mere extension of his being, blazed with a fierce and unrelenting intensity, cutting a swath of destruction through the enemy lines like a scythe through wheat. The enemy, their positions crumbling beneath the onslaught, stumbled backward in disarray, their cries of terror and despair mingling with the thunder of the guns in a ghastly symphony of destruction. As the battle raged on, the outcome hanging precariously in the balance, the lone warrior pressed forward, driven by a fierce and unyielding determination to survive, to overcome, and to emerge victorious from the abyss of chaos that had engulfed the world. The air was heavy with the stench of death and smoke, the sky above a deep, foreboding crimson that seemed to darken with each passing moment. And yet, even in the midst of this unmitigated chaos, there existed a sense of eerie calm, a feeling that the very fate of the world hung in the balance, poised precariously on the edge of a precipice from which there was no return. The landscape was forever altered, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn asunder by the catastrophic event. The immediate aftermath was a surreal tapestry of chaos, with the stench of death and destruction hanging heavy in the air like a miasma of despair. The once blue skies were now a deep, foreboding gray, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the devastation that had been wrought upon the earth. As the survivors stumbled through the ruins, they were met with a scene of unmitigated horror. The streets were littered with the bodies of the fallen, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles, their faces frozen in perpetual screams of terror. The buildings, once proud and tall, now lay in shattered heaps, their rubble-strewn facades a testament to the unforgiving power of the calamity that had struck. Casualty reports began to trickle in, each one a grim reminder of the scope of the disaster. The numbers were staggering, with tens of thousands confirmed dead, and countless more missing or injured. The hospitals were quickly overwhelmed, their corridors filled with the wounded, their medical staff working around the clock to tend to the endless stream of broken bodies. Individual stories of survival began to emerge, each one a testament to the indomitable human spirit. There was Maria, a young mother who had been trapped beneath the rubble of her apartment building. She had managed to free herself, but not before witnessing the horrific deaths of her husband and child. Now she wandered the streets, her eyes vacant, her heart heavy with grief. Then there was John, a former soldier who had been visiting the city when the disaster struck. He had used his combat training to rescue several people from the debris, including a small child who had been separated from her parents. As he cradled the child in his arms, he couldn't help but think of his own family and the loved ones he had lost in previous conflicts. The rescue efforts were ongoing, with teams of emergency responders working tirelessly to locate and extract those still trapped beneath the rubble. The sounds of their labors filled the air, a constant reminder of the desperate struggle to save as many lives as possible. The dogs, trained to detect the scent of human life, moved with purpose, their handlers following closely behind as they navigated the treacherous terrain. As the days passed, the true extent of the devastation became increasingly clear. The city's infrastructure was in shambles, with power lines down, water mains burst, and communication networks severed. The rule of law began to break down, as looters and scavengers emerged to take advantage of the chaos. The authorities struggled to maintain order, but their efforts were often hindered by the sheer scale of the disaster. In the midst of this chaos, small acts of kindness and compassion began to emerge. Strangers became friends, bonding over their shared experiences and their determination to survive. Neighbors who had never spoken before began to look out for one another, sharing what little food and water they had. The community, though shattered, began to heal, as people came together to support one another in the face of unimaginable tragedy. The government, faced with the enormity of the disaster, began to mobilize its resources. Troops were deployed to maintain order, while emergency supplies were airlifted into the affected areas. The international community rallied to offer support, with aid pouring in from around the world. The outpouring of generosity was a testament to the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope. As the people struggled to come to terms with the new reality, they began to ask the inevitable questions. How could this have happened? Could it have been prevented? What did the future hold for their shattered city? The answers, much like the rubble-strewn streets, were uncertain and would take time to uncover. But for now, the survivors could only pick up the pieces and begin the long, arduous journey towards recovery. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. The city, though still reeling from the disaster, began to show signs of life. The rubble was slowly cleared. The buildings were rebuilt, and the streets were repaved. But the scars of the tragedy would never fully heal, and the people would always remember the day that their world was forever changed. The event had left an indelible mark on their collective psyche, a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment. The stories of the survivors, though unique, shared a common thread. They were tales of loss, of grief, of struggle, and of resilience. They were a testament to the human spirit, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, there was always a way forward. The people, though broken, would rebuild, and their city, though shattered, would rise again. The future, though uncertain, would be brighter, and the memories of the past would serve as a reminder of the strength and the courage that lay within. As we conclude our comprehensive analysis of the subject, it is essential to delve into the long-term geopolitical implications that have shaped the world we live in today. The complex web of alliances, conflicts, and power struggles has had a profound impact on the global landscape, influencing international relations, economies, and societies as a whole. The repercussions of these events have been far-reaching, with some effects still unfolding to this day. The shifting balance of power has led to the emergence of new global players, while others have experienced a decline in their influence. This, in turn, has resulted in a realignment of international alliances, with nations seeking to secure their interests and protect their sovereignty. The delicate dance of diplomacy has become increasingly intricate as countries navigate the complexities of a rapidly changing world. One of the most significant consequences of these geopolitical shifts has been the rise of new economic powers. The growth of emerging markets has created fresh opportunities for investment, trade, and cooperation, but it has also introduced new challenges, such as increased competition and the potential for conflict over resources. The global economy has become increasingly interconnected, with nations relying on each other for goods, services, and capital. The long-term effects of these developments have been multifaceted. On one hand, they have contributed to unprecedented levels of global prosperity, with many nations experiencing rapid economic growth and improved living standards. On the other hand, they have also exacerbated existing inequalities, both within and between nations. The widening gap between the rich and the poor has become a pressing concern, with far-reaching implications for social stability and global security. Furthermore, the geopolitical landscape has been shaped by the evolving nature of warfare. The rise of asymmetric warfare, terrorism, and cyber attacks has posed new challenges to national security, as traditional military superiority is no longer sufficient to guarantee protection. The proliferation of advanced technologies has created new vulnerabilities, and nations have been forced to adapt their defense strategies to address these emerging threats. In addition, the impact of globalization on national identity and cultural heritage has been a subject of intense debate. The world becomes increasingly interconnected. There is a risk of cultural homogenization, where local traditions and values are lost in the face of global influences. This has led to a resurgence of nationalist sentiment in some countries, as people seek to preserve their unique cultural identities and protect their sovereignty. In conclusion, the long-term geopolitical impact of the subject has been profound and far-reaching, shaping the world we live in today. As we reflect on the complexities of international relations, economics, and security, it is essential to recognize that the global landscape is constantly evolving. The future is inherently uncertain, and the challenges we face will require cooperation, diplomacy, and a deep understanding of the intricate web of relationships that shape our world. As we navigate the complexities of the 21st century, it is imperative to adopt a philosophical perspective, recognizing that the world is a complex, dynamic system, influenced by a multitude of factors. The pursuit of knowledge, understanding, and wisdom is a lifelong journey, and it is only by embracing this journey that we can hope to create a more just, peaceful, and prosperous world for all. As you have joined me on this comprehensive analysis, I invite you to subscribe to our channel, where we will continue to explore the intricacies of military history, geopolitics, and international relations. By subscribing, you will gain access to a wealth of knowledge, insight, and expertise, helping you to better understand the complex world we live in. Together, let us embark on this journey of discovery, and may we emerge wiser, more informed, and more enlightened, as we strive to create a brighter future for generations to come.